we're going to do is we are going to have Sam and Jordan steelman each other's points from last night so that you can hear what that sounds like. Now,
here's what I think Jordan thinks I'm getting wrong. I think that was grammatically correct. Maybe there's another note in there, but clearly I don't understand how valuable stories are, how deep they go, the degree to which stories encode not only the wisdom of our ancestors, but quite possibly the wisdom born of the hard knocks of evolution of the species, right? So there's no telling how deep the significance of the information encoded in stories goes. And there's a class of stories that are religious stories, and they're religious for a reason, because they're dealing with the deepest questions in human life. They're questions about what constitutes a good life, what's worth living for, what's worth dying for. These are things that if each individual just thrust onto the stage of his own life, not knowing where he is and tasked with figuring out how to live all on his own, or even in a collection of others who are similarly unguided by ancient wisdom, this is not knowledge we can recapitulate for ourselves easily. And so we edit or ignore these ancient stories at our peril, at minimum at some considerable risk, because we don't know how much, we don't really know what baby is in the bathwater. And so we should have immense respect for these traditions. And this is as yet to be discovered tonight. I'm still not quite clear about how this links up with more metaphysical propositions about the origins of certain of these stories. But at minimum, my criticism of religion, because it tends to focus on the most obvious case of a zero-sum contest between religious dogmatism and scientific open-ended discussion, doesn't address this core issue of the significance of religious thinking and religious narrative, because I am, for the most part, just shooting fish in a barrel, criticizing fundamentalists, and the kind of God that the fundamentalists believe in, the God who's an invisible person who hates homosexuals, obviously that's not the deepest version of these religious, this essentially what is a narrative technology for orienting human life in the cosmos. So maybe I'll leave it there, but that's, I think, what Jordan thinks.
So Sam believes that there are two fundamental dangers to psychological and social stability. Religious fundamentalism, essentially on the right, and moral relativism and nihilism on the left. And so the danger of the right-wing position is that it enables people to arbitrarily establish certain revealed axioms as indisputable truth, and then to tyrannize themselves and other people with the claims that those are divine revelations. And he sees that as part of the danger of religious fundamentalism, and maybe religious thinking in general, but also as something that characterizes secular totalitarian states that also has a religious aspect. So that's on the right. And then on the left, well, the problem with the moral relativism nihilism position is that it leaves us with no orientation, and it also flies in the face of common sense observations that there are ways to live that are bad and that there are ways to live that are good that people can generally agree on, and that statements about those general agreements about how to live can be considered factual. Now, and then the next part of Sam's argument is that we require a value system that allows us to escape these twin dangers. One stultifies us and the other leaves us hopeless, let's say. And that value system has to be grounded in something real. And the only thing that he can see that actually constitutes real in any provable sense, and there's a certain amount of historical and conceptual weight behind this claim, is the domain of empirical facts as they've been manifested in the sciences and technologies that have made us incredibly powerful and increasingly able to flourish in the world. And so we need to ground our value propositions in something that we've been able to determine has genuine solidity so that we can so that we can orient ourselves properly, so that we can make moral claims and that we can avoid these twin dangers. We can begin with some basic facts that we can identify, as I mentioned briefly, what constitutes a bad life: endless pain, suffering, anxiety, tremendous amount of negative emotion, short-term lifespan, all the things that no one would choose voluntarily for themselves if we would all agree that they were thinking in a healthy manner. And we can contrast that sort of domain of horror with the good life, which might involve, well, certainly freedom from privation and want and undue threat and anxiety and hope for the future and all of that, and that we can agree that those are poles, good, bad, and good, and that that's a factual claim. So Sam also claims that we can define the good life, this is an extension of it, with reference to flourishing and well-being, and that can actually be measured, and that we should and can inform the idea of flourishing and well-being with empirical data. Having said all that, he also leaves a domain of inquiry open that would be centered on the possibility that some of the ideas that have been encapsulated in religious phenomenology, if not in religious dogma, might be worth pursuing as well, that there might be wisdom that could practically be applied in terms of perception to spiritual practices, although those become increasingly dangerous as they become ensconced in dogma. And so that's Sam's position. And then his criticism of my ideas, he would say that it's facts, not stories, that constitute the ground for the proper science of well-being, and that we don't need to be connected to stories, ancient stories in particular, to thrive. And the reason for that are that these ancient stories are pathological in certain details, especially in the specific claims they make, which look outrageous in some sense from a modern moral perspective. And he believes that it's hand-waving to ignore those specific topics with a what would you call it, an optimistic overview of the entire context. That they're dangerously outdated now, if they ever were useful. That they're subject to too many potential interpretations for any modern usage to be reliably derived. And so he believes that attempts to interpret these stories, let's say, are rife with so many potential errors of bias and interpretation and subjectivity that all the interpretations in some sense are unreliable, and perhaps equally unreliable. That worse than that, not only are they unreliable, but they're dangerous insofar as the claims they lay out pose a threat to scientific and Enlightenment values, which are the true saviors of humanity, as evidenced by our progress, let's say, over the last 200 or 300 years, and that they're also susceptible to the totalitarian interpretation, which I described earlier, which confer upon the interpreter a sense of and then a claim to revealed truth. And so I would say that's Sam's argument and his criticisms of my position. So,
okay, so you write my next book. I'll write yours.
Now, if I catch either one of you regressing to the mean tonight, I will hunt you down and I will ridicule you on Twitter tomorrow. So you have been warned.
Okay. I think we should touch this issue of metaphorical truth, because I think it still gets at the distance between us.
Sure.
Yep.
And happily, this is your phrase that you have. I mean, you might want to. Do you want to prop up this phrase?
Why not? Yeah. So the idea of metaphorical truth, which I think actually is the reconciliation between at least the points that you guys each started out with, is the idea that there are concepts which are literally false, that we can falsify in a scientific, rational sense, but that if you behave as if they were true, you come out ahead of where you were if you behave according to the fact that they are false. And so to call these things simply false is an error. In effect, the universe has left them true in some sense other than a purely literal one. And so religions would then, according to actually what you heard from both Sam and Jordan, religions would fall into this class of things. These are encapsulations of stories and prescriptions that if you follow them, irrespective of whether they literally describe the universe, you end up with certain advantages that you may not know why they are there, but nonetheless you are ahead of your you're ahead of your position if you were to navigate just simply on your perceptions. So right. That's the concept.
Yeah. So that anyone who's worked with guns at all must have heard this admonishment to treat every gun as if it is loaded, right? And you actually, last night when I alleged that you believed in God, you corrected me. You said, no, you live as if God exists, right? And so this seems like there's a connection here. So if I had a gun here that I wanted to show Bret, if I know anything about guns, I'm going to make damn sure that it's unloaded, right? I'm going to pull back the slide, I'm going to drop the magazine, pull back the slide, check the chamber, and do this in a redundant fashion that really looks like I'm suffering from obsessive compulsive disorder. I mean, it is truly redundant. And then I'll hand it to Bret, and if Bret knows anything about guns, he will do the same thing, having just seen me do it. And if he hands it back to me, again, I will do the same thing, even though there may be no ammunition around, right? So it really is crazy at the level of our explicit knowledge of the situation, and yet absolutely necessary to do. And it's not merely, it runs very deep. I mean, that whole time you're careful not to point the barrel of the gun at anything you would be afraid to shoot. And when people fail to live this way around guns, they, with some unnerving frequency, actually shoot themselves or people close to them by accident. So it is really the only proper hedge against just the odds of being in proximity to loaded weapons. And yet, if someone in the middle of this operation came up to us and said, actually there's a casino that just opened across the street that will take your bets about whether or not guns are loaded. Would you like to bet $1 million as to whether or not this gun is loaded? Well, of course, I would bet those $1 million every time that it's not loaded because I know it's not loaded. So there's a literal truth and a metaphorical truth, otherwise known as a very useful fiction, which in this case is actually more useful than the truth, right? But the only way I can understand its utility is, and even utter the phrase metaphorical truth in a way that's comprehensible, is in the context of distinguishing it from literal truth.
The wolf that gives up first lays down and puts his neck open so the other wolf can tear it out, and then the other wolf doesn't. And you could say, well, it's as if a wolf is following a rule about not killing a weaker member of the pack. Of course, wolves don't have rules. They have behavioral patterns. But a self-conscious wolf would watch what the wolves were doing and then say, well, it's as if we're acting out the idea that each wolf in the pack has intrinsic value. And then that starts to be, and maybe the wolves would have a little story about the heroic forbearing wolf that doesn't tear out the neck of its opponents, and that's a good wolf. Well, that's good wolf ethics, and so, but it's grounded in the actual behavior. Okay, so we'll put that aside for a second. Now, here's the sacrificial story. So human beings have made sacrifices. It seems to be a standard practice all around the world. And in the biblical narratives, they would often sacrifice something of value, like a valuable animal.
Well, like a child. Start.
Well, look. I'm not making light of this. I know that human sacrifice was a part of this.
Yeah, but that's again. So just to give you a crib on where my mind goes here is human sacrifice is as old a religious precept as we know about.
Yes.
It's a cultural universal. The other sacrifices are derivations from it. Circumcision is a surrogate for the far more barbaric act of human sacrifice, and it answers every test you would put to it with respect to its archetypal significance, its compelling presence in stories across all cultures. But the horror is that it actually has taken place in all these cultures based on explicit beliefs in the presence of just
right. Well,
oppressive scientific ignorance.
Well,
it's the notion that we're in relationship to invisible others that can mistreat us based on our not having offered enough. Not precisely those others.
Well, but we're in relationship to the invisible others who will judge us in the future.
Okay, you're changing the noun in important ways.
I know, but I'm also trying to understand, and I'm not trying to argue against the horror of child sacrifice.
No, I would never imagine you would.
I know, but I'm also trying to.
But my work would be much easier if you did that.
Yes, and the work of journalists as well, although they've tried that pretty much anyways.
That's right.
Imagine this. Imagine that there's a rule of thumb. Sacrificing what you find valuable now will ensure certain benefits in the future. Well, then the question becomes, how good could those future benefits be? And so that might be heavenly, let's say, in the archetypal extreme. And what's the ultimate sacrifice that you have to perform? And then I would say, well, the child sacrifice fits into that category. And
the issue here, for me, is that you don't need a conception of, you don't need any kind of positive gloss on human sacrifice as a meme or as an archetype in order to form a coherent picture of the future that can motivate you. So delayed gratification is fully separable from a notion that it might ever be rational or good to sacrifice a child as an offering to an invisible other that doesn't exist.
But how do you know?
That the notion that Christianity is actually a cult of human sacrifice. Christianity is not a religion that repudiates human sacrifice. Christianity is a religion that says, actually, no, human sacrifice is necessary, and there was only one that, in fact, was necessary and effective, and that's the sacrifice of Jesus. And I think that is, when you dig into the details, not only a morally uninteresting vision of our circumstance and how we can be redeemed, it's morally abhorrent, right? So I just think at a certain point you have to acknowledge that some ideas are not only wrong, but their effects are disastrous, or have been disastrous, or will likely be, even if good in certain circumstances, will likely be disastrous in the future. And then we shouldn't be hostage to these ancient memes. We shouldn't have to figure out how to make the most of the worst idea that anyone's ever had, which is maybe you should sacrifice your firstborn child to a being you've never seen. I'll just concede that the hardest case for me, I mean, which I did up top, just in defining, after you define metaphorical truth, and I used the gun example, there's certainly cases where the useful fiction is more useful than the truth. I would grant that, but I think those cases are few and far between. But handling guns is one of them. It's just not useful when the casino opens across the street and you can place $1 million bet, right? Then you want to have some purchase on the literal truth. So
life is unbelievably cruel and difficult. And one of the problems that comes when you discover the future is that you might have to make the most painful of sacrifices. And lots of archaic people do this sort of thing.
Human sacrifice is a larger horror than that. So you have what was very common is the sacrificing of captives. So you take the Aztec sacrifices, where you now have slaves, some of whom you're going to.
Yeah, the Aztecs sacrificed about 25,000 people a year.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, it's clearly a bloody mess. There's no doubt about that. But, one of the things that you see happening in the biblical narrative, which is extraordinarily interesting, is that you see echoes of child sacrifice at the beginning. But what happens is the sacrificial notion gets increasingly psychologized as the story progresses.
Certain books and certain ways of speaking have a completely different status. And they have this status because they may, in fact, it's imagined, not be the products of merely previous human minds, but they may be the products of omniscience. And this is where the respect accorded to religious tradition is totally unlike the respect we would accord to anything else. Mythology, literature, past science, past philosophy. I mean, people can read Plato and Aristotle for their entire lives without ever being fully captured by the kind of dogmatism that every religion demands that you be captured by if you're really going to be an adherent.
I would say that's actually an archetypal truth. The idea that the pathological tradition stands in the way of update. That's an archetypal truth. I mean, one of the reasons why in creation myths, one of the variants of a creation myth is that the hero has to slay a tyrannical giant in order to make the world out of his pieces. And it's a metaphorical restatement of the idea that a tradition can become hidebound, and when it becomes hidebound and too rigid, that it interferes with current adaptation. But the problem is, and this is, I think, this is something we really need to hash out. The problem that you're describing is the problem of a priori structure. Now, some of that's textual, but some of it isn't textual. Some of it resides in us as our psyche, insofar as we act.
The problem I'm describing here is that we have two categories of books in this case, right? We have those written by people like ourselves, just endlessly open for criticism and conjecture, and those written by invisible, omniscient entities.
But I would presume that if these religious systems weren't codified in books, if they were still just enacted or dramatized, you'd have the same objection. It's not the fact that they're in books that's relevant.
Well, no, but it is the dogmatism. It's the fact that we can't jettison the bad parts.
Okay, it's the dogmatism. Okay, so to me, that's the same as the problem of structure. Now, here's the problem, I think, with the way that your argument is laid out. And I'm not saying it's wrong. It seems to me that this is a place where it needs to be developed, because I see that the attempt that you make to derive the world of value from the world of facts as justifiable given what it is that you're attempting to do, which in principle is to make the world a better place. But there's a massive gap in there. It's like, how do you do it? Because the objection that you place on my reasoning, let's say, which is, well, the problem with these texts is that there's an infinite number of interpretations, and which of them how can you determine which of those is canonically correct, is exactly and precisely the same criticism that can be levied against your attempt to extract a world of value from the domain of facts. It's the same problem.
Well, it's not, I mean, that's why the moral landscape for me is a landscape of peaks and valleys. And so, I'm totally open to the possibility, in fact, certainty, that there are different ways for similar minds, and certainly different ways for different minds, to be constellated so that they have equivalent but irreconcilable peaks on the landscape. So there's a lot of well-being over here, and there's a lot of well-being over here, and there's a valley in between. And so it's a kind of moral relativism. It's kind of like, this is great and this is great, but these are irreconcilable, right? And so it matters who's right. Obviously, if I knew that an eternity of fiery torment awaited somebody who didn't make the right noises about one faith or another, well, then it would only be rational to make those right noises, right? So it's my bet. I'm placing a bet on certain pictures of reality being wrong, but the reality is we're navigating in this space, and morality and ethics are the terms we use for how we think about our behavior affecting one another's experience. So if you're in a moral solitude, if you're on a desert island, or if you're alone in the universe, morality is not the issue you need to worry about, but well-being still is an ever-present issue. It's possible to suffer, and it's possible to experience bliss and perhaps something beyond that. And the horizon in both directions is something we'll never fully explore very likely. I mean, we don't know how good things can get, and we don't know how bad they can get, but that there's a spectrum here is undeniable. And I would say that my moral realism simply entails that we acknowledge that it's possible not to know what you're missing. It's possible to be living in a way where you are less happy than you could be, and not to know why, right? And just not have the wisdom to make the changes. And that matters. If anything matters, that matters.
Yes.
Okay. So you have argued, and you've actually quite surprised me by doing so, you've argued that the dogmatism is a bug and not a feature. You've argued...
No, it's a bug and a feature.
Okay, it's a bug and a feature. Good. So,
yes.
But what I thought I heard you say was that the resistance to update was a problem, that effectively it was an obstacle.
Yeah, so is lack of resistance to update.
Right, okay,
There's problems everywhere, man.
Well, there's a tension. Okay.
There is a tension.
There's a tension.
There's a terrible tension.
Okay.
Right, well, look at it this way. Look at it this way. Most new ideas are stupid and dangerous.
But most old ideas are as well. I mean,
but some of them are vital.
Yeah. Like, we could have, I get emails from people who can point to the paragraph where they lost their faith, right? Where in reading Richard Dawkins, or hearing a debate between me and some theologian, where it's just a collision against rationality, which is so useful in every other context, suddenly proves its utility in this context, where they think, well, okay, clearly I know the Muslims are wrong about the status of the Quran. Let me take that spirit of criticism in the internal space of my own culture, and what moves? Well, a dogmatic attachment to Christianity has to move by that same standard.
Well,
and it's possible to do that, and that's not a matter of getting into the brain and changing your perceptual apparatus that has
Well, the distinction between different levels of what would you call it? Structure-related processing in the brain and the relationship to the underlying biology isn't clear. And it isn't clear when that's biological and when it isn't. So, your comments about our a priori perceptual structures notwithstanding, there's no clear line between what constitutes an instantiated, accurate biological perception and something that shades more into a cultural presupposition. So it's a gray area. Now, here Elvis Presley's
It's here.
guitar,
I will
the
tell
same
it to you.
thing. It's like, where in the guitar is the fact that it's Elvis Presley's guitar? Well, it's nowhere in the guitar. Well, what is it in? Where is it then? And the answer is, it's in the dominance hierarchy of values that's been socially constructed around the guitar. It's located in interpersonal space. And that location, so value is located in interpersonal space. And if you want to say, well, that's also a fact, it's like, okay, but we're starting to stretch
it's a fact
the
about the
dimension.
beliefs and desires and conscious states of all the people involved.
Okay,
right?
well,
That's the
fair
only
enough.
place where it exists. That's the only
Fair
place
enough,
where the
but-
idea of Elvis's guitar can show up.
Okay, well, which part of it? The
We could
behavior?
detect it. We could figure out what the value of this guitar is based on some intersection
Sure, we
between...
could take a behaviorist approach and we could see how much work people were willing to do to
Yeah,
to
but also
make contact with
we
the
can
guitar.
we can scan their brains and see what. See
Well,
how-
I'm not so sure we can do that.
Well, clearly the brain is involved.
Hypothetically, we can do it, but practically, we're not so good at it.
no.
Because the MRI data, generally speaking, is junk.
Well, we can table that. That's,
Well,
that's,
look, it's
that will
not
be
like
a
it'll
profoundly
be junk.
controversial
It's-
statement in
Well, it's
MRI
not-
circles.
it's-
So that the
Well, you're
totality of that
basically- What you're
picture
basically stating,
is
as
the
far as
value.
I can tell, is that there'd be a socio-cultural agreement as to the value of whatever this entity is, and that would find its mirror in the brain. And that's a non-controversial statement, because all socio-cultural phenomena that are experienced find their reflection in the brain. The fact that you can say that that's reflected in the brain, it's like,
Right, okay,
yes,
but
okay, but
the
I don't
problem
understand why
we
it's...
continually run into with religion is that you have a domain of so-called sacred values where people who are otherwise rational cease to be rational actors. So this,
Well, then is that a fact? Well, yes, it's a fact. It's a fact about subjective judgment. It's okay. Well, the Israeli claim on the land and the Palestinian claim on the land is a subjective judgment that's a fact.
Yeah,
it's like, so how is it
yeah,
irrational?
because it is the true analogy here, the complete analogy is rather like we're about to fight over Elton John's glass, and Elton John was never here, right? Whatever the Christians and the Muslims and the Jews think they're getting from their attachment to their dogmatic and irreconcilable religious worldviews can be gotten just as well by a deeper understanding of our universal and non-culturally bound capacity for ethical experience, spiritual experience, community building, and we can
what's
touch
that grounded?
space.
What's that grounded in?
We can touch that space
What's
without
that?
because
Fine,
it's
fine.
almost like the status quo is. It's almost like you're content to live in a world, or at least you're content not to judge too harshly a world where fans of rival soccer teams or baseball teams regularly kill one another over their fandom, right? Like what if that were the status quo? It's like it's been this way for thousands of years. There must be a reason for it.
Look,
People
I'm not
really
trying
like
to-
sports.
I'm not trying to justify the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
No, but
I'm saying that
you
casual
shouldn't be too
attempts
quick to judge the sanctity of their differences of opinion.
Okay, no doubt about it.
What do we do about
Well,
that?
this is
Do
exactly
you have
why.
a sorting algorithm?
Yes.
What is
I'm
it?
trying to get to it.
Okay.
Okay, so this is actually why I asked Sam this question. It wasn't an attack. It's like, okay, so look, people have these belief systems, Christian, Muslim, Jew, we'll say for that, and you're saying abandon those, let's say, and move towards this transcendent rationality. It's like, okay, two problems. It's not so easy to abandon a belief system because you end up in the morally relativist nihilist pit, and that's a problem.
One doesn't have to. And
Well,
many people don't.
people tend to, and so it's a
Well, no,
very
I mean,
major problem.
It's just not. I mean,
No, they don't have to. Look,
That's wait.
Sam,
That's an empirical
right.
claim that we would
don't-
have to find out whether that's
They-
true.
well, they
but
don't-
there's
they
a lot
don't-
of evidence against that.
Yeah, well, there's plenty of evidence for it too, but it's beside the point to some degree because that isn't something that I want to quibble about. Perhaps there are transitional paths, and sometimes people find a collapse of their faith actually freeing. It's certainly the case that many of the people who are happy about what you're doing have found exactly that in what you've been saying, and more power to you. And so I'm not willing to dispute that. But what you said was, okay, here's these belief systems that are ancient and complex, and we can step outside of them, and there's this transcendent rationality that we could all aspire to that would solve the problems. It's like, okay, what is it?
Well,
what is it exactly?
It is, at a minimum, to value all of the variables that conspire to make the one life we know we have
Okay, you
worth
can't
living.
value all those variables.
Well, no, we're doing it right. We do it every day in how we organize
No, we
ourselves
don't,
in
because
society.
we apply an a priori framework to the variables to reduce them to a tiny subset that we can manage. And it's the nature of that a priori framework that we haven't been able to have a discussion about. We have an a priori framework that narrows our perception to almost nothing. It's built into us. It's partly socially constructed. It has a deep neurological substrate. And we actually understand how it emerges to a large degree. And the thing is that...
But I don't think that's actually our difference. I mean, so the a priori framework operates in many different spaces, which again, we can't necessarily analyze, but it makes it no less true. So if you put your hand on a hot stove, you will immediately feel a very good reason, in fact, an unarguably good reason to remove it, right? And it doesn't require moral philosophy to get you there. You don't need to inspect your a priori framework. You just have to feel, holy shit, this is the worst thing I've ever felt, right? And there's so many moments like that in life that we dimly understand.
What if you're trying to rescue your child from a fire?
Well, exactly. Then you have some other goal, right?
Yes,
that is going to
do.
cause you to brave that suffering, right?
Yes.
But again, trying to rescue your child from a fire is pretty close to as the hot stove in not needing to be analyzed, right? The imperative to rescue it becomes harder when you have to rescue someone else's child from a fire, and you're worried about orphaning your child who's standing next to you on the sidewalk, right? Then we get into the domain of moral philosophy, and then you can say, well, you know, how much do each of us owe the children of other people, right? How much should I risk my life and risk orphaning my child to rescue your child? That's when things get interesting in a philosophy seminar, and that's where people begin to hesitate. People begin to, we are biased toward protecting ourselves, protecting our kin, protecting our friends, and only then do we begin to extend the circle. And again, but this is not a mystery where we want to go here. We want to extend the circle more and more and build institutions and societies that implement our best selves at our best moments more and more. It makes it more effortless to be good in the world. We want good incentives.
Can we take your example seriously here for a second?
Yeah.
All right. So you are built to be more likely to rescue your own child than someone else's child from a fire. We in society might like for the minimum number of children to die in fires as possible, which gets you to sideline that consideration in favor of, is there a child who's faced with a fire who I might rescue? Religions do exactly this restructuring of values because they say something like, actually, your goodness in risking your own life to save that other child from a fire is observed, and it is calculated, and you will be rewarded for it in some way.
That's one possible benefit of some religions. Most of people's religious attachment is born of having it drummed into them by their parents, right? But the truth is,
no, their parents and their parents' parents and their parents'
yes,
parents'
exactly.
parents.
But if we did the same thing with Batman and Spider-Man, it would have the same effect, right? Like if you relentlessly told children, right? I mean, I've got two little girls who are dressed up like Batgirl right now. They love Batgirl. There's nothing. I don't have to do anything to make them more enthusiastic about superheroes, apart from just showing them the pictures of superheroes, right? If I told them, in addition to look how fun this is to dress up like Batgirl, in addition, you're going to burn in hell for eternity if you lose your emotional attachment to Batgirl, even for a minute, right? Well, then it's going to be Batgirl for the rest of their lives. Especially if the entire culture is doing likewise. And again, this is...
Well, as Bret pointed out already, a bad tool is better than no tool at all. And if Batgirl is the closest approximation to a divine figure that you can conjure up, it beats the hell out of none at all. And if Batgirl didn't partake of certain archetypal structures, no one would give a damn about Batgirl.
Okay, I'm
And so
gonna-
Spider-Man and Batman
I'm gonna spare
play
you-
play a role in the culture.
right.
Because,
Yes.
look,
hold
it's
on.
not accidental. It's not accidental that superhero stories have a structure. And to say that, well, Batman and Spider-Man are obvious fictions and we could use them as moral exemplars, which we do.
You're taking the wrong end. You're taking the wrong end of this. I'm not minimizing the power of stories. Right? I'm saying we can understand their power without recourse to believing things we shouldn't believe now in the 21st century.
I still need an answer to the question about what it is that's this transcendental rational structure without an a priori dogma, because I don't see it.
Well, it's not. Well, again, we touched on this a little bit last night in that I freely admitted that in every domain of human inquiry, no matter how, I mean, the most hard-headed, so mathematics, logic, physics, at some point we have to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. At some point we make a move that is not self-justifying and is not justified by any other move that's more rudimentary.
Right, that's a statement of faith. That
Well,
thing that you just laid out.
that's a callow use of the term faith.
No,
it's not the
it's
same
a
kind of
precise
faith.
definition of an axiomatic statement of faith.
My faith that 2 + 2 makes 4.
That's not faith.
Well, no, it is. No, it's my intuition that this is a valid and replicable and generalizable principle, right? You give
No,
me
that's
two
not
objects.
faith either. Your statement that that's a useful claim is a statement of faith, but neither of those two were statements of faith.
No,
Those
it
are
was.
statements
They're
of
statements of
observable fact.
intuition. No, these are intuitions. These are because they're intuitions that can run afoul of other discoveries and other intuitions, as you know, which.
Well, if mathematical facts are intuitions, then what are we doing with facts?
We've arrived at the point where we have to decide.
This is super important, though.
Super important, okay.
Okay, we don't lose this.
Okay, yeah.
For 2,000 years, people have been studying geometry and had a very well worked out set of mathematical intuitions with respect to Euclidean space, flat geometry. And then some brilliant guy, Riemann might have been the first, said, well, actually, you can curve space. I can bend this triangle, and all of a sudden it has more than 180 degrees, right? That's an intuition that people tuned up pretty quickly, but all of humanity was blind to it for the longest time, right? These are, what I mean by intuition is, it's the thing you're using to understand something that you are not in a position to analyze.
I understand that.
But that's not faith of the sort which is, listen, I know the Bible was dictated by the creator of the universe. I know Jesus was his son. I know he rose from the dead. I know he'll be coming back. And 1,000 other propositional claims
if it's a statement of faith
highly
and it's
implausible.
valuable, if it's a statement of faith and it's in the value domain, how is it derivable from facts? So look, I mean, it seems to me, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, is that you made an absolute moral claim in the moral landscape, and that's what grounds your argument.
Okay,
The
but wait a
absolute
minute.
moral
Let's
claim
just take
is-
this evil piece, because it'll be interesting if it's not totally on point.
Okay.
The reason why evil is susceptible to total deflation is, if you agree with me, evil is a category of human misbehavior, human intention, that we don't understand significantly at the level of the brain. But if we did understand it totally at the level of the brain, then every evil person we had in the dock at trial would be just like Charles Whitman with his brain tumor after he shot up everyone at the University of Texas, right? So, like, he's the prototypically evil mass murderer, but he's complaining about this change that overcame his personality, and he thinks it would be a good idea that if after the cops kill me, you autopsy my brain, because I don't know why I'm doing any of this, right? And lo and behold, he had a glioblastoma pressing on his amygdala, and all of a sudden it made sense of his behavior in a way that a full understanding of psychopathy or every other variant of human evil would make sense of it in a way that would be deflationary ethically.
Okay.
And then you would look at someone like Saddam Hussein, or the worst evil person you could imagine, and you would say, well, he's actually unlucky. There but for the grace of biology go I. Because if I had that brain, if I had those genes, if I had those influences that gave me those synapses, I would be just like him. Now, if you think there's some other element that gives us free will, and now then you and I are disagreeing. Then that's a factual claim that's at variance with mine. But
okay.
if we are just on some level malfunctioning biological systems when we're being evil, then a complete understanding of evil would cancel that category.
Can
ethically.
you define evil so we know what you're talking about?
Well, take just the worst people who have sadistically victimized the most people, and those are the evilest people we can name.
So wait a second. So when you
But I mean, if your thesis is that if we had the measures of well-being that were appropriate, we could use them in a positive way, and the response is, but we don't have those measures, it's like, okay, well then what do we do?
Oh no, we have measures. I mean, this conversation is a measure. I don't like that. That's a measure, right? You step on my toe and I say, "Ow." That's a measure. Don't do that again.
But that's not a measure of your well-being. It might be a measure of your trait neuroticism.
Well, it's a measure of.
But I mean that.
These are non-points.
No, but I
You
mean
shouldn't
this.
be-
I mean this technically.
Yeah.
If you look at the well-being measures that we have,
Yes.
they degenerate into measures of neuroticism.
No.
That's
we,
all they are.
But we don't have measures of certainty, of belief, of compassion, of joy, any of these conscious states. We have neural correlates of some of them, but we don't have. There's no
then how do we
helmet
use,
I can put on
how
you.
do we use
hold on.
facts about them to orient ourselves in the world then?
Because we're doing that. We're doing this all the time.
You've got an instantaneous measure, though. You've got an instantaneous measure of well-being. We can all check with ourselves, see how we feel.
And
But
it's possible to be wrong about that.
Right,
Always,
sure.
always
Sure.
wrong about it.
but it degrades as you get away from the individual's ability to check internally. On the
Well,
other
even
hand,
the internal thing isn't reliable,
It's
because
not
lots of times
reliable,
you're
and-
happy when you're doing things that
well,
are
sure,
terrible
and
for
you could
yourself.
take a drug that would make you feel very good and would cause you to take apart your own life because it would
You mean like
remove-
cocaine, for
right?
example?
It would destroy the motivational structure that gets you to do stuff of value that you're
Right, so we
justified-
can't use emotion, moment to
Right.
moment emotion, as an indicator
Right,
of
the
well-being.
instantaneous is not good, but you have a parallel problem. It looks to me like the exact mirror image, which is that you've got an integrative, long-term measure of well-being instantiated in an evolutionary belief system, but it's coming apart because we are living in circumstances that are less well mirrored. The present does not mirror the past, and therefore these
Yeah.
truths, which you believe are timeless, are degrading
Yeah.
rapidly.
That's
You tell people about one needy little girl in Africa, and you give her a name and show her picture, and what you elicit is the maximum altruistic, compassionate response from subjects. You go to another group of subjects, you tell them about the same little girl, give her the same name, but also tell them about her needy little brother, right, who has the same need, and their response diminishes, right? Just the addition of a single person diminishes the response. And this is a moral fallacy that we're all living out every day, because if you care about this one little girl, you should care at least as much about the fate of her and her brother. And when you add statistics to it...
No, you shouldn't, because
Well,
you'll
no, you
exhaust
should.
yourself. No, you shouldn't.
This is a
because
bug,
you'll
not a
exhaust-
feature.
Man, you'll exhaust yourself in the attempt.
No, because we need...
What, are you willing to care for 100 people with the same intensity that you care
here,
for one?
this is what this software flaw gets us. It gets us people who will watch for hours a day with effortless and tear-stained compassion the saga of the little girl who fell down the well, but who will blithely turn the channel when they're hearing about a genocide that is raging and hundreds of thousands have already died.
Sam,
right?
listen, guys.
This is something we have to.
If you let the
we have
full
to
horror,
correct for this.
if
No,
you
I'm not
let
talking
the-
about person. No, but you're misunderstanding me to great effect here. That I'm not saying that you should personally be overwhelmed by the death toll every day. I'm not saying that it's functional for you and I to each personally get up each morning and just drink deep of the full horror of all the bad luck that is spread.
No,
all
maybe
over the
it
world.
is, but maybe we can't handle it.
But as societies, we need, when you're talking about how we spend our money, how we apportion foreign aid, the kinds of wars we fight or don't fight, the kinds of then we have to correct for what is in fact a moral illusion, which is we know that if we tell we tell one compelling story about a little girl, right, we could go to war over that, right, whereas we won't be motivated by a genocide. That's the kind of thing that moves whole societies now. And if you add to it the bogus religious sanctities, if we burned a Quran on this stage tonight, the rest of our lives would be spent in hiding, right? Because of how motivated people would be to address that pseudo problem, right? That's the world we're living in, and civilization, insofar as we have a purchase on it, is a matter of correcting for those errors. And religion, for the most part, not across the board, but for the most part, is standing in the way of those course corrections.
Well, the thing that I'm struggling with is that I still can't understand in what your ethos is grounded. Because you claim like a transcendental rationalism, but you won't identify the structures that produce it. It's a black box. And when I try to push you on the absolute nature of your ethical claim, which is that the bad life is worse than the good life, and that we should, in fact, universally work towards the good life, it doesn't seem to me that you'll accept the proposition that that's a universal claim.
No, it is. Well, should is irrelevant here. It's just the fact that there is the possibility of moving in this space. If you move in the wrong direction, if you move far enough, you'll like it less and less.
But why is should irrelevant?
Given the minds you have,
well,
right?
Well, I thought
what if you had to accept moving in the wrong direction and experiencing less and less well-being in order
to get to a better place?
Maybe even just to survive. Suppose a population has to endure a generation and a half of misery in order to persist for another 100
ethically
years.
That's a perfectly intelligible circumstance that people have had to face, and it's on my moral landscape, it's analogous to, we might be at one local maximum or some high point, but we're moving down a slope to get to yet some higher place, right? So some things may only be possible if we made some painful and net unpleasant sacrifice to get there.
That's for sure.
Yes, and so that can be rationally apprehended. There can be an argument for that. It could be we all have to go on a diet, otherwise we're going to die of this problem, right? We all have to stop eating whatever it is, wheat, right? It's a hard sacrifice for people who have to stop it, as you know. If that were just true, well, then there'd be an argument for it. There'd be evidence that would convince us. We would stop. We would feel the pain, and we would get whatever benefit that was on the other side of that sacrifice.
Belief in the supernatural aspect of these stories never alters the calculus of what people should do. That the divine nature of a story about Jesus doesn't motivate people to do something that they might not have the courage to do otherwise. The belief that they might end up in heaven because their good work is going to be observed doesn't alter their behavior.
Well, yeah, I know it alters their behavior, but rather often for the bad.
Well,
no, this is what worries me about. I think there's something. There's a profound net negative that we are paying the price for every day by believing in paradise, right? A belief that this life, it probably doesn't matter very much at all, because we get what we really want after we die is, forget about the evidentiary basis for that belief. It's ruinous for prioritizing what we should be prioritizing in this life. And
I agree with that, by the way.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's interesting. Yeah. On certain points, even if we felt that really believing the fiction was advantageous to people, depending on which fiction you're talking about, there's too much evidence against it. You can't decide to believe something for which you have no evidence simply because of the good effects, the good experience it will give you, or you imagine it will give you. I mean, that's why Pascal's wager never made any sense. I mean, you can't say, the only way you can believe something to be true, really true, not just metaphorically true, is to believe that if it weren't true, you wouldn't believe it. That you stand in some relationship to its truth such that that is the reason why you believe it. Now, you can't be telling yourself, I have no evidence for this thing, but I know life would be better if I believed it to be true, and so therefore I really believe it's true.
You don't think people do that all the time?
I don't think they do. I think they do things much more like we're talking, the metaphorical truth we're talking about. We act as if things are true without forming any strong propositional claim, and that's fine. That's fine. That has its own utility. So the World Cup is on right now, and we literally billions of people care down to their toes what happens to this little ball as it traverses a lawn, right? And if it goes into the net, it really matters. And if it fails to, it really matters. And
It always matters if we hit the target, Sam.
but this is something we have manufactured to care about, right?
No, it's something that speaks to us unbelievably.
It's quite literally a game. This is a game that people are playing, but some people take it taking it further than than seems truly rational is part of the fun. But the people who can't turn that off.
It's a metaphor. Soccer's a metaphor.
Yeah, but there are people who the fullback who kicks an own goal and then goes back to his South American village and gets murdered, right? He's surrounded by people who are taking the game too seriously.
Yeah, okay, I agree.
Yes, and so my problem with religion is that so much of the time we're meeting those people, and we're not criticizing those people. We have no place to stand to criticize those people because we're so attached to the game.
Fair enough.